So now let's talk about trimming your board. There's a couple ways to do this. One is by utilizing your shims, but the most easy way to trim your board is just adjusting your stance. So the fastest way to find your sweet spot is by putting the board down on the water, keeping your speed and keeping the board on plane, which means keep that board level on the water, and getting in that proper riding position. So our chest up, our hip forward, nice and tall. Now, when we do this, we want to keep the board glued to the water. And we're going to slide our stance back to the rear of the board. So just slowly heel toe, shuffle your feet to the back of the board, but keeping that board on the water. It's crucial that you do so. The only way to do this is by sending our hip forward, bending that front knee, shifting our hips to the front of the board, and keeping it down. Now, once you move back enough to where the board wants to lift and you can barely hold it down, what I want you to do is take your back foot, put it under your back hip, and if you need, you can move that front foot a little bit more forward. But the idea is to get that board barely lifting, but keeping it down and moving your stance as far back as possible. When you actually go to fly, you're going to notice you're going to have equal foot pressure, and that's the goal. You want to be comfortable on both feet. Now, how do we know that we're at a trim? Well, if you feel like you have a lot of front foot pressure, you're probably too far back. If you feel like you have a lot of back foot pressure, you're mostly too far forward. So think about this. If you're really far forward on the board, in order to lift, you have to really increase that back foot pressure to pitch that wing up, or you have to give it more throttle, more speed. Well, riding really far forward on the board at a high speed is kind of dangerous, and it puts a lot of pressure on that back foot. It also limits your steering capability. So trimming your board is the right way to do it. So put the board on the water, adjust your stance back, stay in that proper riding position. Once you feel the board's about to lift, move that back foot underneath your back hip, and now you're in the sweet spot. Just slowly shift your hips back, let your board rise, and just steer with your head. Now, the second way to trim is using shims. What shims do is basically you take your rear wing and you can adjust the pitch. If I positive shim, it basically is angling down and creating lift in the front wing. If I negative shim, I'm basically pitching this stabilizer up and it pushes the nose down. Now what this does is it changes my foot position. So if I positive shim the rear stabilizer, it's actually going to increase front foot pressure. So now I have to ride more forward on the board. If I negative shim the rear stabilizer, it's actually going to decrease the pitch and make me ride more back on the board, causing more back foot pressure. So play with the shims, play with your stance, find the exact stance that you're looking for. The goal is to actually create equal foot pressure on both feet, and you can do this with any shim. You just have to adjust your stance on the board where necessary. Now, there's also front shimming. Front shimming is a great way to equalize your thrust pitch. So we have our rear pitch, our rear stabilizer shimming, and then we have our front wing shimming. Now, if we negative shim the front, it's actually pitching the front wing up, which is creating more lift. If we positive shim the front, it's going to create more downforce in the front wing. Now, why would we shim the front and the rear? Well, if I negative shim the back and negative shim the front, the rear stabilizer is going down, the front wing is lifting up, and it actually creates pressure on the thrust, creating a smoother, or how could I say, a more equal thrust pitch. That might sound confusing right now, but think about this. If I create that pressure, so this is creating lift, this is creating downforce. Now, when I add throttle, instead of nosing up or nosing down, I'm actually just going to smoothly rise up and down. So there's many different ways to utilize your shims to trim. You can actually trim your thrust pitch, you can trim your foot pressures, you can trim your stance position on the board. So get out there, play with all the different numbers of shims, trims, and adjust your feet however you like. If you have any questions on trimming your board, you can always send us a message at Gnarly Harley Adventures, and we'll help you trim your board so you're riding smooth.